right, recording is active for our ambient work group meeting. Do we have Keith? Yeah, Keith is here. Do you want to? It looks like you own the agenda this week, Keith.
I stacked up a couple things post KubeCon and then between Thanksgiving and time off just to get to them. But I don't know that we're necessarily going to get to a lot of decisions on any of these. So happy to time box it each one at like 15 minutes or so, depending on discussion. First topic is on CRLs and OCSP stapling support for dtunnels and possibly sidecars. We had a kind of an early discussion, preliminary discussion about this in Slack. But setting this up for some context, the position of the Istio project historically has been that we don't need CRLs for Istio D issued certificates, specifically because, or even workload level certificates, because the whole point of a service mesh is to have short-lived certs. And if you've got 24 hours for the cert to expire and not get renewed, that's a better mitigation than having CRLs. However, in a multi-cluster context, you typically have longer-lived certificates that are your intermediates. So you've got one sort of organization-wide root CA with various intermediates potentially per cluster in a multi-cluster context. And there might arise a situation where there's a cluster that's compromised, and you want to immediately cease communication with that cluster and have connection stop. Most intermediate CAs, from what I've seen, live for around anywhere from 6 months to 5 years, maybe even 10 years, because they are the root CA for their domain. In this example's case, it's the root CA for that cluster. And if you don't have a CRL or any other mechanism for revoking trust for that intermediate, the certificate verification is still going to pass. There's still a trust chain that's established. That's intermediates from the trust chain, and communication can continue unless you rotate your root, which is a very difficult and complex process. So what I am proposing is, at a high level, design doc to follow if we can get some directional approval here. What I'm proposing, and Jackie started a conversation around this on Slack, is to have ztunnel and sidecars and waypoints. I believe waypoint only talk to ztunnel, so it might not need CRLs for waypoints, but generally for ztunnels and at least ztunnels and sidecars to support talking to a certificate revocation, or talking to a CA that provides a certificate revocation list, or having that certificate revocation list be mounted to the proxy as a secret, so that if it encounters a connection that is on that revocation list, it will drop the connection. That's the sort of the context and the proposal. Does that make sense first, as far as the motivation, before I talk about implementation details?
I think I understand the technical motivation, right? Like this is well trodden, but I think it would be useful to provide a little bit more kind of industry ecosystem information, right, Keith, about the choices here, right? Because these are not the only choices. And obviously the CA ecosystem itself, right? While Istio provides a CA, right, it's very often that particularly more security sensitive people are using some third-party CA infrastructure.
Right.
Like Spire, for instance. And so we need to be cognizant that it's not necessarily our job to solve all problems in this space. And so if there are other ecosystem things solving these problems, we have a decision to make about whether we should take on solving these problems or tell people to use those other tools.
So CRLs and OCSP stapling are the, from my understanding, are the sort of industry standards in certificate revocation land. Spire does have other options, of course, but that's mainly because Spire is sort of a fully end-to-end attestation and identity server implementation that can do a lot of things. And if you do have some sort of revocation need, then Spire can potentially. I'm not an expert on Spire, so I'll have to defer to folks who know more about that.
Yeah,
than
and
I do.
I'm not saying like we should gather all this context and try to talk about it right here and right now. But I think like any design document, right, is going to have to cover this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Like the CRLs, right, have like pretty weak industry support, right? Like they've been around a long time. They haven't really had a lot of traction in the kind of public internet domain, right, because of their painful limitations around distribution. That some of those things don't apply to Istio, some of those do, right? So like we have to just cover, right, the state of the universe as providing context to making design decisions here. And then, deciding whether to consider this part of the identity layer or part of the authorization layer, right? There's those concerns that just came up in the thread. Yeah, like it's a conversation that needs to happen. I agree with that. I just think we need some more industry context.
Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I want to clarify, just making sure we're on the same page. What you are presenting is also a problem with Istio sidecar work today. Is that correct? So basically in sidecar, we don't support revocation list. And we do have a lot of user using sidecar today, right? Whether it's single cluster or multi-cluster, and seems people are able to handle fine. I mean, they may be happy with our default certificate expiration window, or maybe they change it to a shorter window, which we do provide configuration for that. So is this a particular thing you guys are looking at to make Istio more secure? Or do you hear a lot of users asking for this?
I have seen some, just off the top of my head, I feel like I've seen some users ask for it. Just one clarification, the Istio does support revocation for gateways, for gateway certificates, for your classic front-end SSL certificates. There is the ability to do revocation. However, there is nothing for revoking intermediate certs. What you would do with Istio is like you would provide, if you did have a case where you needed to, there's a cluster in the mesh that wasn't trusted for whatever reason, or had an issue with its intermediate CA, you'd rotate the intermediate CA. That assumes that you have access to the compromised cluster, however, and that you can rotate the intermediate CA of that compromised cluster, of that part of the mesh. If you don't have access to that compromised cluster, then there's not much you can do except for rotate your entire root CA so that the trust chain is broken. And that is very painful and not acceptable in a lot of cases. To your point, Louis, a lot of people who have more robust full feature solutions for identity management, that's just they're solving it outside of Istio, basically. Again,
well, like on that last part, like I'm not actually sure that they are, Keith. Right, there's a general maturity discussion to be had. Like people say they want zero trust. Okay, use Istio. It's a good way to get zero trust. Like we have best practices around intermediate authority management, certificate lifetimes, right? Whether you use 1 day, 7 days, 30 days, right? Nobody should be doing infinite, and for the most part, they're not, right? Because the defaults prevent them from doing that. But the arguments around, okay, I need access from an operational level to perform remediation, the right? Like CRLs are designed so it's not the point of vulnerability where you're providing the protection, it's the point of access where the protection is being provided, right? So let's say there's a rogue cluster with a rogue IA that you can't get access to, or like the IA has been stolen and someone's just issuing search out of it and calling stuff, right? You know, the only protection that you have is to protect the other things, right? Like you're not protecting the client because the client's the thing that's malicious here. You're protecting the consumer, the things the client is trying to attack. And by definition, if you're trying to protect them, you must have administrative access to them. Because if you don't have administrative access to them, you can't protect them, right? Because you can't like do anything.
Yes, but the way you protect them, the only way to protect them today in Istio is to change all of the change the root.
Right. And so then there's do we offer enough like controls to protect, like leading, like see, I just wanted to separate like the administrative ability, like what actions can like we reasonably expect people to perform, and then what protections can we provide when with that, you know, the ability to perform that type of action. You know, and CRLs being an example of, okay, we can push CRLs out to these things, so then we can revoke certificates from the chain. As an example of that, right? Because CRLs are basically an authorization policy, right? It's like, don't accept a credential with this property.
Pretty much,
do accept credentials, yeah. OCSP stapling is a little different. And it has its own industry quirks as well. But we don't have to get into the weeds about that here, and I don't remember all the weeds anyway. I just remember there are weeds. But I just want to be careful about like the operational dynamics versus the capability. And like I'm fine with the idea of providing more protection, by the way, or providing more capability. I just want to make sure we provide it the right way and line up with what the industry is trying to do in general, because we don't want to be swimming upstream too hard. Like that causes us all kinds of headaches.
Also, for me, this feels a lot like this is more of a question about what CAs we integrate with, because some CAs do this, some don't. They do it different ways. So, you know, should zTunnel support this is not quite the right question. It's more like what workload CAs should zTunnel support? And if it supports CA X, Y, or Z, do they support CRLs or not? And then that's the question for that integration, really, right? It's more of an integration point of what CAs we do support in zTunnel, if we support more than one, right? You know,
although I do agree,
really do this,
like that, like CRLs and CAs are almost like orthogonal things, right? CA products can, like, some of them choose to distribute CRLs as a feature that they provide,
right?
And some don't. But the CRL itself is actually logically separate.
It is. It's just that you may, you know, depending on what CA you're intending to support, you may have no use for them, or you may, right? It really depends. Like,
I mean, if you really wanted to, you could deploy your own hand-rolled CRL. Like your CA might not support it, but you could literally deploy your own CRL that says don't accept certificates that have this serial number or what have you, and boom, you've got it, right?
It really depends on how you're integrating, right? Because like if I don't believe you can do like this sort of thing through like SDS, right? Like sidecars are using to deploy to distribute certs, so like there's no way to like express this sort of thing through SDS.
So well, I guess there's the whole question, like, then do we treat it as authorization, right? Which means like the identities and the handshakes all pass, but then you reject the traffic based on a policy check that's distinct from access or handshake, right? Or do you try and bake it into the handshake layer, right? And there are pros and cons to both.
But if I'm not mistaken, right, CRLs are typically handled by the CA, right? Like that, they're the ones that provide them.
No. CRLs are distributed just like root trust bundles are, generally speaking, at least in browser land.
Right, but they're typically distributed by the CA that mints the certs, right?
Yeah, well, that's an implementation detail that CAs were also the ones shipping the CRL feature.
Right.
Yes, like for example, Google Cloud CA, whatever the name of it is, Google CAS. You can revoke a certificate and then have Google's CAS write the CRL to a storage bucket. Right. It doesn't push it to your proxies, but then you can hook up Kubernetes to pull from storage bucket and all that sort of stuff.
You can like get it if you want. Yeah.
Right,
so
exactly.
They coupled the management operation around root material or revocation to the distribution function. because obviously that makes sense. But it doesn't have to be done that way.
Okay, fair enough.
And to the XCS point, Ben, all validation contexts and XDS, I believe all validation contexts have a field for CRLs. And so that's going to happen at the transport socket layer.
Right, but that's also, by the way, an implementation detail, Keith.
Plus,
Right,
I agree. He mentioned XDS specifically, and I was just
oh yeah,
bringing that
SDS,
up.
yeah. Like it gets a lot more complicated. Like there's one thing to like revoke the certificate from a handshake perspective, another thing to revoke it from a distribution perspective. And honestly, trying to rely on revocation at distribution time is fallible.
Yeah.
So I would be very wary of any process that says, hey, we're just going to prevent distribution of the certificate SDS, because once it's exfiltrated, like none of that matters, right?
Oh, agreed. I was specifically referencing the fact that when Envoy is validating the certificate, and like in a transport socket, you can set the path to the CRL for it to use in order to check the peer certificate against, not that Envoy somehow doesn't receive the certificate or something like that.
Right. Yeah. Then the question would be, does Envoy or whatever data plane implementation like ztunnel, does it do a good job reporting the information in a way that's useful from a security management standpoint and from a telemetry standpoint? Right. If the client just gets handshake error and not a lot of other information, that's not great, actually.
Agreed. Yeah.
Like you'd like to know this was revoked, and maybe some additional metadata about why it was revoked, and that to feed into the telemetry system, so then you could alert on it. So we want to make sure that the holistic life cycle of what CRLs are supposed to do works throughout the system.
Yeah, big plus one for sure.
And maybe you want to treat revocation as soft revocation, right? Like you may revoke, but you're like trying to test revocation, right? Or you're trying to figure out, right, like what clients are currently using certificates that I really should be revoking and migrating. Just like we have like the audit check in Auth policy to say, well, we're not going to reject the request, but we are going to specially log this is occurring. So there are those types of operational concerns as well.
Yep, I actually I added a field into Envoy to be able to log the CO numbers from the cert chains, and that's something that you can now use in access logging. That would be something that we could leverage in order to just be able to audit and see what certs are being used on each handshake, and have that, people can have that bubble up through their log ingestion software and things of that nature. But yeah, plus one to completely, close the loop on the entire experience, ideally, from the Istio perspective.
I think what else should be covered in the design. No, I think that's probably a good start. You look at those things. Somebody's probably want to go read through the IATF meeting minutes as well for the last 3 years to get the sense for what's going on in the public internet.
Louis, that's what ChatGPT is for.
Is it? The IATF meeting minutes, by the way, can be hilarious. So I recommend reading them. And if you ever get the opportunity to go to an IATF meeting in person, which I have never done, but people I've worked with have, I highly recommend it. It's how the internet really works. And these are the people who kind of make those decisions. They also know how to pick really good restaurants and locations for their meetings. So you'll, by definition, have a good time.
We'll keep that in mind. I think the last one was in Dublin. So if I'm ever in, I'll find where the next one is and stop by if I can. This is all I've got on this first topic. It sounds like, again, the consensus is, okay, yeah, we're curious. Let's see a design doc. Is that a fair summary? Cool. Thanks everybody. Anybody have any last things before we move on to the next topic? All right. This one is also mine. Big thing I wanted to just briefly discuss post KubeCon is we had a lot of people ask about sidecar interop, specifically being able to run sidecars in the same mesh as you're running Ambient. It's interesting. I was talking with Mitch about this. A lot of our early surveys and feedback from users, sidecar users, was we don't really care about Ambient. We've got sidecars tuned and ready to go. Interop's not a huge priority for us. And at KubeCon, it was like night and day from what I experience anyway. Kind of want to see. I know we've got some things that are lying around in ICOD. Like I know sidecar support HPhone. Do we what is our sort of priority on getting sidecar interop to past alpha, and then is that a priority, and then what is left to do?
By the way, I think we have some basic sidecar interop. If I remember correctly, one of our first user in the community, he was running sidecar. He was running some of his service, at least one in sidecar, and the rest of services in Ambient, because on that particular service he has, I think it's missing. I think we didn't support the exclude ports or something, so he couldn't move to Ambient, but he do have interrupt going. I think if you are doing interrupt without waypoint, it should be definitely, there is a path there that you should be able to interrupt. That, at least that's my understanding. I think that's what Sacco uses too.
Yeah, what
Yeah,
waypoint
so I mean,
is the? Oh, go ahead, Louis.
I mean, there's some very obvious things missing, right? Like testing, documentation, documents describing how you should migrate for given contexts, right? So there's these kind of big high-level threads that would need to be pulled together, right, to make it work and to deliver a product, right, effectively. There's obviously bits work, and some users have stumbled into getting those bits working, but we don't claim to support it, right? I don't think we've made that claim on any of the documentation. But there are probably some things that do work, but I wouldn't tell any user to try it.
We might set our experimental alpha at one point, but I think some of the users tried it anyway, even without us.
Yeah, right. I'm sure alpha, you could probably cobble something together, but for production use, right? It's alpha. No.
Yeah.
So I guess those are the parts, right? And there's interop, and there's migration. Right, Keith, so putting my product manager hat on, were the conversations I want to migrate or I want to permanently interrupt?
The conversations I had were around permanent interrupt. I want to use sidecars with Ambient. Were the ones that I was having.
I'm going to test that a little bit, because I've had the same conversations, and then when I poked people, they said they wanted to migrate.
You may be correct, and in hindsight, I wish I would have asked that question more frequently. I think first of all, I do think that the reason users want to migrate service by service, and I think that necessitates some interop.
Oh yeah, no, don't get me wrong. There is no instantaneous migration like that. We don't do that for upgrades even, right? So no, there's no such thing as atomic in this universe. So there has to be interop. But what the outcome dictates what the UX is, really, right?
To some extent, I think starting at the bottom technologically, Our current guidance for both deploying waypoints and anything we might have around migration around waypoints, or any documentation we have around migration period, is going to say deploy a waypoint level a namespace level waypoint, and use that sort of to jumpstart your migration. If sidecars can't talk to that waypoint, then that's going to pose an issue for the migration path, right?
Like there's the infrastructural baseline requirements, right, for traffic to move over in a non-atomic fashion, right, in some granular fashion. But like what APIs, what controls, what's the pacing, right?
Right. For what it's worth, I'm less concerned about the full migration experience, because quite frankly, I think that that's going to be difficult for us to be prescriptive about as a community, because Ambient purposely has a lowered API surface, smaller API surface. It's got some different ways of doing things, and a sort of prescriptive guidance for generally how to migrate is going to be found wanting, I think, by a non-trivial number of users. So I think a migration doc would be better served giving principles and considerations for migration rather than specific step 1, step 2. My question, the reason I phrased it interop, is because I'm more interested in the infrastructural requirements to enable sidecars and Ambient to exist in the same mesh, the same set of infrastructure. And especially with the cluster design that is underway. Shameless plug, I sent a message earlier. There's a new doc for people to review. But with that conversation progressing, right, one of the natural questions is, okay, what is this going to look like for a sidecar implementation? Sending to like a sidecar client in one cluster, sending to an Ambient captured application in a different cluster. And so to even be able to answer those questions, I think it's important to be able to understand where we are on interop, because that's also a migration path, right? One option is, hey, spin up a separate cluster for your Ambient stuff and move workloads from one cluster to another cluster with sidecars or planners or something like that. Not to recommend it, but that is an option. So my focus is more specifically on the technical blockers and missing work for interop. Hopefully that helps.
So is your requirement having sidecar and the waypoint works in the same cluster, or do you see having sidecar and waypoint work on different cluster? Because if we recommend people to start with a new cluster, then they wouldn't have sidecar and waypoint on the same cluster.
That is technically true. That's a good point. So I kind of set that offhand, but you can imagine a scenario in which our guidance says, hey, to migrate from sidecar to Ambient, spin up a fresh cluster, install Ambient on that new cluster, add waypoints where you suspect you're going to need them, and if per namespace, and then deploy your new application in that cluster. And then assuming multi-cluster and Ambient gets to beta stable quality, you have your sidecars send traffic your sidecars can send some of their traffic to the remote cluster. And then you slowly migrate one to the other, and the sidecar never has to send to a local waypoint. That is one option. I don't think I necessarily want to be forced into that option, but to answer your question, Lynn, I think it's too early to make that determination for what exactly the scope of sidecar interop needs to be from a project perspective. Yeah, so that's a shameless non-answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the multi-cluster problem, you probably always will exist if you use more than one cluster.
Yes.
But having sidecar interrupted with waypoint in the same cluster may not exist if we tell people, hey, let's just start a new cluster to do your migration, because that's the easiest way, the cleanest way to do it.
Yeah, if you make the determination, yeah, absolutely, and that might be a good place to start. However, there is the pure timing of it. Like if we're the multi-cluster work is underway. But if we happen to not make it in for 125 at like an alpha state, the earliest, right, as a project you'd be recommending users to do this in production would be 126, which is a bit further out. What is that? In May. So not terrible. But if we didn't ship in 125 in alpha and we shipped in 126 for alpha, now the earliest users can think about migrating and some sort of real supported capacity would be 3 months from August, which is 3 months from May, which is August. And that's a bit far. Now you're starting to get into KubeCon 2025 territory. We got the feedback from KubeCon 2024.
Even
So
timelines aside, I think that there's also a consideration of is requiring a multi-cluster setup to migrate from sidecar-based Istio to Ambient, introducing more complexity for a user, and like what kind of a barrier is that?
Yeah, I don't think we would require multi-cluster. We would only require multi-cluster if the user are already using multi-cluster for sidecar, right? So if they are single cluster today with sidecar, what they could potentially do is stand up a new cluster and then not taking any traffic on that new cluster and then move their services. When I say move, it's kind of like recreate their services in the new cluster, but in Ambient. And when that cluster is kind of tested, they can potentially shift the traffic to the new cluster, right? So the old cluster and new cluster, they don't have to talk to each other. It will be a traffic shift when the new cluster is fully migrated. So that in that path, we don't really need multi-cluster. The only time you would need multi-cluster is when you're using multi-cluster sidecar today. It's probably not reasonable to ask you to move all your cluster at one time. So there may be time you have your cluster on sidecar and some of your cluster on Ambient.
I think that's like, it's preferable for customers that we can get to adopt the kind of like clusters as cattle approach and are okay like spinning up new ones and deploying workloads onto that with like a new configuration or new Kubernetes version, whatever it may be. But I think Ben kind of phrased it well. It's like, is that really a migration, or is that you're just asking him to spin up a new thing and start fresh? I don't think that necessarily addresses the like service by service incremental migration that Keith was talking about initially.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't think anybody would say that it was. That said, we should probably actually document the how to do the full cluster migration pattern.
That's step
Because it
one.
was like, well, not step one, right? There are many paths you can go down. This path works today, right? If you don't have multi-cluster communication, right, and all you do, right, you have replicas and they're fronted by an ingress, you can migrate them cluster by cluster. Because we'll actually learn stuff from that, right, about the policy experience, right? So you have sidecars, right? You stand up another cluster, deploy all the apps, apply, right, Ambient there. You have to make some policy changes, or you might have to make some policy changes. So we would actually learn something even by documenting that pattern for people. But it doesn't solve the clusters pets problem. It doesn't solve the multi-cluster problem, and it doesn't solve the in-place partial migration problem, which are all valid problems. Right, so I'd call it the isolated cluster migration story. Which is like, it's not super uncommon, right? People have like 2 or 3 clusters. They're effectively global replicas of each other, fronted by an ingress, right? And they have active passive or something like that, and then they migrate one of them, test it, filter traffic over. That's what people have done, as far as I can tell, reading through the Slack. So, right, it's an established pattern, an undocumented one.
Yeah, agreed. That's what I meant. Step one doesn't mean people would do as step one for us to document. So make that an option.
Oh, sure. Right. Sorry.
Yeah, so that option is require no code change. And whenever we can figure out the interrupt, we could potentially add the migration within the same cluster.
Yeah, and so then I guess coming back to kind of like playing the product manager role, the reason why right, so then like what's the next most important case? So we have one that already works, which we should document because it's the only thing we have that works that we can document. But what do we think the next most important case would be? Like a single cluster in place because the cluster is a pet. Multi-cluster because but I still want gradual migration, right? So I'll bring up one application in the new cluster and I need interop, but I'm going to do it via the multi-cluster route. So the cluster is not a pet, but it's a very slow dying cattle. I'm not sure what the polite phraseology is for that. So like talking to users, trying to figure out what's going to help them migrate, right? And also getting some understanding of their pacing, like how quickly would they like to do it? If they are migrating, or if they intend to be in a permanent interrupt state. Just knowing, like I suspect most users, like because I prompted them, want to migrate because they don't want the operational overhead of doing both sidecars on Ambient, right? I get the worst of both worlds. People are generally trying to keep their operational burdens down. So it's like asking the question, like, okay, if you're trying to migrate, do you need to be able to complete the migration in a day, a weekend, a month, a quarter, a year, right? Like, what's your budget? It's a useful piece of information in this process. Yeah, so I guess there's the technical track, Keith, and then there's the product track to this topic, and we need to make progress on both parts.
Yep, agreed. Okay, so to summarize the technical side of it, we need to kind of do a survey of what works and what doesn't, and document that somewhere and close the gaps. On the product side, to help inform the order in which we tackle the technical side, we need to understand what scenarios are we enabling, what are the explicit migration or interrupt patterns that we want to enable. Because, for example, something we didn't talk about as much in this discussion is, and we've said this at various times during the ambient design process, but maybe I need a sidecar because I need to do something very specific. Maybe I need an envoy filter for this application, so I need to run a sidecar. That's something that we probably need to enable. In fact, that might moot a lot of the other discussion. If we have to solve that, we probably have to solve the domino sort of trickle. So from a product perspective, we need to continue to articulate, like we've done here, migration stories, as well as what are the sort of steady state requirements. Yeah, adoption blockers for people. Like envoy filter, adding a sidecar resolves that. Never mind. I think we're going down a different path. But yeah, okay. This is helpful. Cool.
Which I guess your next topic is about some of this. So.
Oh goodness. Do I even remember what this is about? I think it's been multiple weeks, so I don't remember the details. But I think what this waypoint and namespace policy is about is the experience of when you try to apply a policy to a waypoint. No, sorry, when you have applied namespace policy, does that policy apply to the waypoint or not? For telemetry, for some reason, I want to say I don't think it does apply. You have to do a target ref specifically for telemetry API to send to generate access logs, for example. That's a common thing people use telemetry API for. you have to have a namespace policy to generate access logs, but you also have to do, currently, I believe you have to do a target ref to the waypoint in order to do access logs. Whereas for ALZ policy, namespace, I think is taken. No, I might be lying.
I think only for layer 4, but not for layer 7.
Yeah.
Because I remember trying this and complained. Because initially I thought if I use a layer 7 OSC policy at namespace level, I don't have to do target ref. I think you still have to, just to be very explicit.
Right. And the whole
Yes.
conversation about like, how do I set a mesh wide default, right? And target ref gateway class and that whole thread.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I'm starting to somewhat remember. So this might not be anything. As long as we're consistent, then I think we're good. It might be.
I think we might be consistent, but we might also be insufficient, Keith. There's that problem.
That's fair. Yes, and I think we had some end users. Andrew, turn your camera on at the perfect time I was going to refer to you. Yeah, like we've talked about the gateway class target ref question, and I think there's been a little bit of discussion from folks here at Gateway API regarding some future patterns for how to do that. Can anybody give a report on where we are there? Well, maybe I'm making things up. Maybe we haven't discussed it. Yeah, I thought I
Is that a
recall.
question for me?
Maybe for some reason I remember you saying that there was a Gateway API meeting where some Istio folks came and discussed the policy target ref gateway class, but I might be imagining things.
That did happen. Let me see if I can go dig up notes. I think it's
As
also
you're
still
thinking-
listed on the agenda as like a to discuss, but I think we did talk about it a little bit at some point. Let me go find it.
As you're digging that, I was going to chime in just to say on the idea of waypoints and namespace policies. I think Lynn, you were mentioning like whether or not something needed a target ref. I think Lynn, you chimed in on a thread I had that I was surprised, but it might be that it's documented properly. But I was surprised that it's not that a namespace. Like I was thinking that a namespace policy would not, like if you leave a selector out, say if you've got an undefined selector in an authorization policy. I was thinking it meant it would only bind to like a Z tunnel, but I did not realize at the time that it would also bind to an ingress gateway. It said a waypoint gateway is different and does not get anything from that namespace policy, but other types of gateways may. That seemed maybe not intuitive. It might be correct or the best way to do it, but it was surprising.
That was backward compatibility, Andrew.
I bet it is. Yeah, I bet that's exactly
why. We actually covered it quite a bit in the authorization policy discussion talk. So there's the old Istio gateway API, and then which was the ingress gateway, and then there's the gateway API flavor of that with the gateway class Istio ingress. Yeah. It's a thing. So it was specifically separated and documented for back compat reasons, because otherwise we would have just broken everybody.
Yeah, it might be that it is me that just didn't understand it properly when trying to go through the docs, or it might be that it's still pretty quiet in the docs and could be louder. I don't know. But
It's almost certainly the latter. I guarantee it. In fact, it may not even be in the docs. It might just be in the auth-z policy attachment design document, which is a 30-page document about this. So there's that too.
So action item here for sure. Let's do peruse the docs. Make sure we call this out. And because it to your point about backwards compatibility, we probably can't change the model, but at the very least we can like scream to people reading the docs, hey, this operates differently, maybe even a sentence on why it operates differently, or a phrase about why it operates differently, just to show there's some method to our madness. And perhaps I don't know how you write an analyzer for this, but
John, you might remember, was that partitioning just done for the legacy Istio gateway type, or was it done for the new gateway type with the Istio Ingress class? Right, because those are two different things. I thought it was the former, but I do not remember, and I certainly don't know what's in the code right now. But John might remember.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I don't remember, sorry.
Excellent. Mike?
Yeah, I'm dropping a link in chat to a comment on a proposal. I found that it might not conflict, but it would certainly be awkward. One of the big caveats about targeting gateway class directly was that gateway class is cluster scoped. So I remember that being a complication for having, like, you might have to have cluster scoped things to target it. I think it was something like that.
Is there a permissions issue there? Because anything,
yeah.
anything that can target the gateway class.
Yeah,
and therefore set policy for every single gateway that gets created.
Yeah, it's not like an inherent, there's nothing in the, like, that will block you if you try to do it, but it's not secure if we just say that anyone can do it. We'd have to probably say you can target the gateway class only in Istio system or something like that.
When I went to the SIG and asked them about this, they strongly suggested that we use an extension ref and reverse how things are targeted. So that you don't have anything that can target a gateway class still. The gateway class says, I'll accept this extension.
Oh, sorry, it's not an extension ref, it's the parameters ref field on the gateway class.
Oh, thank you for that. Yep, you're right.
Yes. I thought you brought it up in a meeting. I just could not find the notes yet. I still listed in the to discuss next time section.
Was there a specific rationale? Like, I understand the gateway specification not wanting to standardize gateway class attachment for its own policies. Right, but that's different than gateway class controllers and implementations allowing it for their own policy types, right? Where the gateway class the gateway spec doesn't have to say anything about that at all.
Yeah,
Well,
it's still allowed. I think that it was more that the concern was that the UX and ergonomics around it are awkward. So it was suggested you might not want to do this. Here, there is the notes.
It wasn't prescription.
Yeah.
Yeah, they basically said it probably is allowed. It probably actually was even intended. It's just they've had problems with it in individual implementations, and so they're not recommending it.
All right, Mike, I guess as you work through your auth-z policy stuff, standardization in the gateway, right, as part of a gap, right, you're gonna have to think about this one a lot.
Yes. This is absolutely a use case that we've already been discussing with NetPol's working group stuff and how to layer default deny and where identity-based default deny fits compared to like L3 default deny and how that like needs to layer and doesn't really work if you're trying to default deny things and then the bits aren't flowing. You can't really do an identity-based default deny. So yeah, we've been having extensive discussions about that and we'll certainly continue that.
Okay, we have a few minutes left. Ben, I think you put the topic on DNS capture.
Yeah, this is just a quick recap from the November 20th one. Originally, we had brought up, Costin, I think, had brought up some concerns around having pod level opt-outs for DNS capture. And at the time that was brought up, I was like, okay, well, I'll close the DNS capture pod exclusion PR to try to roll in the selector style thing that we were doing for proposed auto enroll feature at that point, but we're not doing auto enroll now. That selector style API is not going to be there. So I'm just reopening this DNS pod exclusion PR as is, which basically says, before we turn on stuff like ambient DNS capture by default, we want to have a way for people to opt out at the pod level if they don't want DNS capture for that particular pod. This does allow you to have people at the pod level bypass. There's no way to do like, top-down namespace level control for that, where you prevent people from opting their pods out of DNS capture or whatever. But that's also true of ambient and capture generally right now, and we're not changing that, so it doesn't make sense to change it for DNS either. So PR is going to go in as is unless there are objections. Please look at it, and if you have objections, raise them. Otherwise, we're going to do it that way to keep things consistent for the time being. That's it.
Thank you, Ben. It was helpful. Didn't know your topic was so short.
Yeah, sounds good. I think that sounds consistent.
Yeah. All right. Anything else we should be discussing? And thank you, Mitch. I saw the calendar cancellation for Christmas week and the week after for Ambient meeting too. So that's good.
Yes, I think we should be up to date.
Yep. Thank you. All right. Great discussion today. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Cheers.
Take care.